بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبع الهدى. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters, to another discussion and lesson about the harms and detrimental effects of sectarian bigotry, fanaticism towards madhabs and certain personalities, and blind following. The آثار السيئة للتعصب المذهبي والتقليد الأعمى والتحزب. So the spread of sectarian bigotry, blind following of certain madhabs and certain Islamic personalities, and fanaticism shown towards certain madhabs and Islamic personalities amongst the Muslims during Islamic history had numerous grave and terrible consequences that impacted various aspects of the Muslim lives, especially in relation to the social and communal life and interaction between Muslims. Its effects include the breaking of ties, dismantling, and destruction of the internal structure of the Islamic societies, and the involvement of these different sects that emerged in severe sectarian disputes, debates, conflicts, disagreements, and arguments, which were accompanied by slander, constant insults, defamation, contempt, mutual hostility, alienation, hatred, estrangement, accusations of disbelief, takfir, right? Tadliya, calling each other misguided, tabdi', calling other people innovators, and tafsiq, and calling other people wrongdoers and falling into immorality. Also, the outbreak of numerous bloody fights and conflicts among the different Islamic jurisprudence schools of thought, and also initiated by ideological sects that left the creed of the main body of Muslims, in which many lives were lost and widespread destruction, as what occurred in Damascus, what occurred in Ray, what occurred in Isfahan, as we mentioned in our previous discussions. Also, the prevalence of extremism and sectarian fanaticism towards certain schools of thought, either jurisprudential or ideological, and their spread throughout the Islamic lands of both Maghrib and the Mashriq, of the Eastern Muslim countries and the Western Muslim countries, Muslim Spain, Northern Africa, okay, and the likes. Also, bigotry, blind following, fanaticism towards madhahib and individuals led to the weakening of the Ukhuwa al-Islamiyya, of Islamic brotherhood, of companionship, of Islamic unity, which is the foundation of Islam, which are from the maqasid al-kubra, right, are from the great objectives of Islam. And this bond of brotherhood, this bond of Islamic unity, was replaced by sectarian and madhab-based fanaticism, madhab-based bigotry, and blind following. So blind following, madhab-based fanaticism, and partisanship and bigotry was then made as the glue uniting members of a single madhab, a single sect, a single party, thereby distancing themselves from members of other madhabs and other schools of jurisprudence. And this led to the institutionalization of bigotry and division, alienation, and conflict between Muslims, such that each school of jurisprudence came to possess their own mosques, their own schools, their own students, their own teachers, and their own communities and neighborhoods. Also, the dissension and separation of the followers of a particular school of jurisprudence with regards to the fundamentals of the religion, okay, broke into numerous factions, parties, and subgroups within their own schools of jurisprudence. It became common to find individuals affiliated with the same school of jurisprudence, for example, the Hanafis, yet differing in creed, differing in belief, differing in aqidah. For instance, one might be Hanafi in jurisprudence, Ash'ari in creed, and Naqshbandi in tariqah, while another might be Hanafi in jurisprudence, Mu'tazili in creed, and affiliated with the Burayawali path in behavior and conduct. Similarly, one might be Hanbali in jurisprudence and Salafi in creed and practice, while another one is Hanbali in jurisprudence but Khariji or Murji'ah in creed or conduct. Others might be Maliki or Shafi'i in jurisprudence but Ash'ari in theology and Tijani or Sufi in their suluk, in their tariqah, in their path and behavior, and so on. As for the intellectual and scholarly domain, then sectarian bigotry, blind following, and group partisanship also left numerous negative, detrimental impacts. These include, first, the imprinting of intellectual and theoretical research with sectarian bias in both the fundamentals and branches of the deen, which led to heightened disputes and alienation amongst the various groups of scholars. As a result, extremists and fanatics became widespread among all schools of thought without exception. Secondly, the proliferation of fabricated and weak hadith and historical reports, and an increase in lying and dishonest students of knowledge and some scholars. So much so that some even claimed to lie for the Prophet Muhammad or lie on behalf of the Prophet Muhammad. We seek refuge in Allah. And this was driven only by sectarian partisanship and bigotry to people and madthabs, and used to support one's own school of thought and refute anyone who disagreed with them. This led to the widespread circulation of fabricated hadith, fabricated athar, fabricated traditions and stories, and false reports amongst the people, which distorted a significant portion of Islamic history and corrupted many people's understanding of it. And upon such fabrications, lies, deviations, and deceptions, unfortunately, many Islamic governments, states, and countries built their governments, built their schools, and built their institutes. Thirdly, each sectarian group came to rely exclusively on its own sources, its own books, its own curriculum, which differed from those of other schools of thought and other sects. Each drew its doctrines and rulings from its particular literature. For example, the Mu'tazila had their own compilations and books. The Shia had their own books and compilations. The Ibadiyya, the Kharijis, had their own writings. And also those who ascribe to Sunni Islam have their own works and books of the Sunnah and books of Hadith and Tafsir as well. And this only led to the emergence of distinct intellectual schools, methodologies, and sectarian traditions, each characterized by unique beliefs, rulings, teachers, students, curriculum, and literary legacies. And this led many extremist bigots, blind followers, and group partisans to deviate in their understanding of the Quran, and led them to start following ta'wil, following conjecture, following doubts and desires in the interpretation of the Quran, and subjecting the Quran and its meaning to pre-established sectarian and philosophical ideas ideologies, and principles. Also, during the age of blind following, of taqleed, and at-tahazzub and ta'assub, and sectarian bigotry and fanaticism, many scholars, unfortunately, were drawn into the cocoon and bubble of sectarian jurisprudence and shackled by it, diverting them from engaging with and researching and studying the genuine knowledge found in other schools of jurisprudence. They were thus, unfortunately, deprived of fiqh al-muqaran and also deprived of the benefits existing in other jurisprudence schools of thought. Furthermore, most scholars during the era of taqleed, of blind following, and of ta'assub, fanaticism, became estranged from direct engagement with the Quran and with the Sunnah and from the jurisprudence of the early generations of the Salaf. This deprived them of the full and proper benefit of the knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah and the jurisprudence of the companions and their successors. Instead, they became immersed, in the narrow-minded sectarian jurisprudence, wherein the Sharia was only considered to them to be the statements of their jurists and jurisprudence scholars, and the jurists' statements came to be seen as the Sharia. The views of their imams were oftentimes given precedence and priority over the words of Allah and the words of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Also, sectarian bigotry, ta'assub, and at-taqleed, blind following, and at-tahazzub, fanaticism towards certain individuals and madthabs, consumed much of the valuable time and strenuous effort of scholars from all different jurisprudence sects, which they spent serving partisan-based jurisprudence, defending it, and refuting opponents of other jurisprudence schools of thought. And they became entangled in its subsidiary issues, neglecting the higher aims and the universal objectives of the deen, such as ukhuwa, brotherhood, such as adl, justice, such as insaf, fairness, such as unity around the kalimatain, around the testimony of faith, and cooperation upon righteousness and piety, and the propagation of Islam to non-Muslims, dawah. Right? Many engaged in debating about subsidiary issues, right? Issues of jurisprudence, and they neglected giving dawah and inviting non-Muslims to Islam. Also, bigotry, blind following, separation, dissension, and group partisanship, it corrupted the innate sound disposition, the fitrah, and the intellect, the aql of the human being, which is praised many times in the Quran. Right? And Allah mentions ulul albab, right? Of understanding, right? The people of sound fitrah, sound disposition. Sectarianism, group partisanship, fanaticism, bigotry, and blind following distorted and disfigured the natural instinct, the fitrah, and the sound intellect, al-aql as-sahih of many individuals, distancing it from the light of divine guidance and plunging the natural instinct and sound intellect into following the depths of desires, conjectures, and whims. It ultimately led to the denial of fundamental Islamic beliefs and principles, including the attributes of Allah, the createdness of the universe, the principles of causality, and the inherent properties of things, the reviling and excommunication of the companions, claims of Quranic distortation and Quranic deficiencies, and other baseless notions unsupported by authentic transmission, sound reason, or verified knowledge. These are all false doctrines and born of sectarian fanaticism, blind following, and bigotry, which corrupted the minds of those who believed them, adhered to them, affirmed them, taught them, and then defended them. Similarly, sectarianism, bigotry, and blind following emboldened its followers to criticize the imams of opposing jurisprudence schools of thought, while simultaneously weakening their critical engagement with their own. Typically, they would not criticize or refute their own imams, but instead exaggerated in revering, sanctifying, glorifying them, and excusing them, seeking justifications even for their weak and erroneous opinions of their own imams, solely because they are from their own school of thought. And they engaged heavily in polemics and disputes while neglecting objective scholarly inquiry grounded in the Quran, grounded in the Sunnah, and grounded in jurisprudence and the study of jurisprudence, free from sectarian constraints, bigotry, blind following of one particular madhab or imam. Also, bigotry, blind following, partisanship, and fanaticism fostered enduring and ongoing sectarian disputes and fostered more blind following and more fanaticism amongst Muslims, which even persists to this day in 2025 without having found any effective solutions. And this is clearly evident in many of the books, many curricula, and educational institutions of contemporary Islamic groups and sects. It is also apparent on the internet, which is filled with explicitly or covertly sectarian websites, some affiliated with the Shia, some affiliated with the Khawarij, some affiliated with the Mutakallimin, all constantly engaged in disputes, conflicts, insults, defamation, hearsay accusations, exaggeration, and competition, all motivated by sectarian loyalty, hostility towards opponents, and the pursuit of power, influence, and control. As for the political dimension and aspects, then it too was deeply affected by sectarian bigotry, blind following, and fanaticism towards madhabs and personalities, which left numerous negative and detrimental effects, including number one, many Islamic states, governments, and nations during the age of taqlid, of blind following, and ta'assub bigotry were unjust in their treatment of differing jurisprudence schools of thought. When a government or state adopted the jurisprudence school of a particular group, it favored that group and empowered it within the state while marginalizing others, sometimes even oppressing them and dealing with them unjustly and unfairly. This undoubtedly had negative repercussions on the internal cohesion of those governments and Islamic countries, nations, and communities. Secondly, the affiliation of a particular madhab by those states and their participation in promoting and increasing fanaticism consumed much of their time and efforts, which could have been better invested in more constructive, unifying, and collectively beneficial pursuits. Furthermore, such behavior weakened the allegiance of other sects to those partisan states and their governments. Thirdly, their sectarian partisanship caused them to fail in addressing sectarian fanaticism, bigotry, and blind following among the Muslim jurisprudence and some of the ideological sects. They neither unified them, nor eliminated the fanaticism, nor eliminated the bigotry, or eliminated the blind following, nor did they effectively manage it. What they actually did was reinforce sectarianism, deepen it, encourage it, and participate in it. So some of you may be asking, Yes, bigotry and blind following and fanaticism towards certain madhabs had many destructive consequences for individuals and societies. But did it have any positive outcomes for the Islamic community? Well, the answer is somewhat yes. It did have some small and very minuscule positive aspects, okay, compared to its many harms and devastating effects on the land of the Muslims and the Muslims' minds, bodies, hearts, and souls themselves. Among some of its minuscule benefits is that it drove many of its adherents to have some diligence and exertion in service of their particular school of thought and group, where they established numerous academic institutes and produced a vast intellectual heritage in both fundamentals and branches of the religion. And each group came to possess an enormous body of literature, and the books of biographies and scholarly genealogies testify to this. However, these schools are criticized for being, the most part, sectarian and partisan in nature. Likewise, that intellectual heritage is criticized for being heavily influenced by sectarian fanaticism, replete with commentaries and abridgments, but lacking in creativity and innovation. And of course, we're not talking about religious innovation. Another of its positive outcomes is that its dominance over intellectual life led to the emergence of a reformist independent movement of ijtihad, okay, of jurists who used independent, okay, study skills and research, right, in opposition to it. Though small in number and weak in influence, this movement of ijtihad and mujtahideen courageously resisted sectarian fanaticism and exemplified free ijtihad unshackled by partisan and madhab based constraints. Its figures authored valuable works on the practice of ijtihad, on the practice of itibaa, and the denunciation of taqleed, of blind following, and ta'assub, fanaticism. Among them were, from the scholars, Abu Muhammad al-Qasim al-Bayani al-Andalusi, Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, Abu Wafa ibn Aqil al-Baghdadi, Abu Shama al-Maqdisi, Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, Saleh ibn Mahdi al-Maqbuli al-Yamani, Muhammad ibn Ali al-Shawkani, and many others. And in addition to what has been mentioned, three important observations are worth noting, brothers and sisters. First, sectarian fanaticism, bigotry, and blind following caused Muslims throughout Islamic history to lose many of the fundamental objectives of the Sharia, such as Islamic brotherhood, such as unity within the community and cooperation upon righteousness and piety. Secondly, the driving force behind sectarian fanaticism and bigotry was a strange triad: ignorant and blindly imitating lay people, fanatical, sectarian, bigoted, blind following scholars, and bigoted rulers, caliphs, kings, and emirs. These were the ones who called to, promoted, and sponsored sectarian bigotry, partisanship, blind following, thus setting fire to themselves and causing much strife and conflicts in their societies. And lastly, but not leastly, there is a strong relationship between taqlid, between blind following, between at-tamadhub, jurisprudential or ideological doctrinal adherence, and a ta'assub, fanaticism. Many times, blind following of a particular madhab leads to bigotry, argumentation, disputes between other adherents to other madhabs. This is because blind following of a particular madhab or a particular personality in foundational and secondary matters of the deen led individuals to adopt a particular school. which then led them to fanaticism to their particular school of thought and uncritical loyalty, whether justified or not. However, this is not an absolute and clearly, I guess you can say, right, relative relationship, right? It's not 100%, okay, between taqleed, that taqleed will lead to madhab, and madhab will lead to taqleed, and ta'assub will lead to the taqleed, and ta'assub will lead to madhab, okay? So it's not 100% the relationship between taqleed, madhab, and the ta'assub, okay, blind following, adhering to a particular madhab or studying a particular madhab, and bigotry. Because a person may be a blind follower without being sectarian or fanatical, or one may be fanatical without blindly following or adhering to a particular school of thought, and one may adhere to a school of thought without being a fanatic or a blind follower of that particular school of thought or personality. So, in conclusion, brothers and sisters, from what we have discussed throughout these lessons and lectures, that it is evident that sectarian fanaticism throughout Islamic history had a profound impact on Muslim societies, on Muslims' minds, hearts, bodies, souls, on their congregations, and imprinted it with many bigoted sectarian traits and characteristics in the social spheres, the intellectual spheres, and the political spheres. And its negative consequences were numerous and harmful, while its benefits were very few, minuscule, and extremely limited, and extremely um, insignificant, and really not worth mentioning. So we ask Allah Azza wa Jal to make us from amongst the muttabi'een and keep us weary and cautious of the dangers of sectarian bigotry, sectarian partisanship, blind following of madhabs and individuals, and fanaticism towards madhabs and individuals and people who are fallible. May we only be bigoted to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the companions. May we only blind follow the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions, and no one who may have come after them. So may Allah bless all of us. And in our next topic and discussion, we're going to talk about what were some of the causes of sectarian bigotry, partisanship, and blind following. So until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.